Hello, this is Yvonne from Quilting Jet Girl. I was cutting fabric to prepare to test out the Meringue quilt pattern, and I noticed that I could get a little bit creative and save some fabric if I cut Drunkard's Path concave templates differently than I normally recommend in a pattern. Well, one thing led to another, and I decided it was worth a side trip of effort to evaluate where the bias edges fall when piecing curves and the pros and cons of altering from standard practice. Let's take a look. A standard pattern will be written such that concave templates get cut so that the outside, long, straight edges of the template align with the straight grain of the fabric. When cutting concave templates this way, the center of the curve will be a bias edge, and the templates can be rotated along a width of fabric to make the most economical cutting. I did not have a large enough piece of fabric remaining from my desired fabric to do this, but I noticed that I could rotate the template such that the outside, long, straight edges of the template are bias cuts. When cutting concave templates this way, the center of the curve will be more aligned with the straight grain of the fabric. So I did what any sane quilter would do. I cut what I needed, placed an order for more fabric, and then dug in my fabric bins and decided to test out what it is like to sew quarter circle curves with the concave pieces cut differently. I mean, that is what a sane quilter would do, right? Okay, you don't have to answer that question. To evaluate the difference, I wanted to make sure I was working with the same kind of fabric. So I found scraps of Kona cotton in mustard, which is the lightest fabric and the convex shapes, spice, the concave shape with the edges aligned with the fabric straight grain as typically recommended, and ochre, the concave shape with the edges aligned with the bias. Note that I am testing this out using 6-inch finished templates. When sewing curves, I like to pin my pieces together. When pinning, I mark the center and quarter points along both curves. Then I pin by starting with the center marks, then the two ends, and finally the two quarter points. The reason I pin this way is that with a typically cut concave piece, the short legs of the concave piece are aligned closely with the straight grain, and I find it much easier to get the beginning and end points pinned before pinning the quarter points, because as the curve starts to transition to the bias, it's easier to flex the concave shape a bit to match the registration marks. When I was pinning these two different concave shapes, I didn't notice a huge difference in the way pinning the curves went together. I was trying to keep in mind that the straight edges of the ochre concave piece were cut on the bias, but in general, I didn't feel like pinning the curve was manipulating those edges in a way that would stretch and distort the fabric. I did, however, notice a big difference in how the fabric behaves as I was sewing the curved seam. So let's take a look at what that looked like at my sewing machine. The first curved seam that I'm sewing is with the typically cut concave shape. So I am starting out with the concave shape, and it's close to the straight of grain, and as I am moving towards my first quarter point, it's behaving just like I am used to. I'm using my stiletto to keep my fabrics aligned along those raw edges, and you can see that I have a seam gauge that bolts to the top of my sewing machine. This helps me keep nice consistent quarter-inch seams as I'm sewing along my curves. And I just continue along my way. If my pin is out of the way of my needle, I don't necessarily take the time to remove it. But if it is, I slip it out of the way and keep going. Now, the place that I typically have the most trouble when I'm sewing a standard cut concave shape for my curved seams is as I transition out of the bias edge towards the straight of grain at the very end of the curved seam. You can see that the fabric bulks up just a little bit for me, and if that happens, I just lift my presser foot, make some adjustments to my fabric, lower it back down to make sure that I'm not going to sew over a pleat, and continue on to finish sewing my seam. The second block that I'm going to sew is with the bias cut edges along those long straight edges. So the curve, when I'm starting out, has a bias edge here, and it behaves a little bit differently. The curve seam starts out fine, just like I'm used to, but as I'm sewing closer and closer to the center point of those curves, you can see that I'm having more trouble with my stiletto keeping the fabric raw edges aligned in that quarter-inch seam allowance. So you're going to notice that as I'm sewing through the center of the curve, it's the straight grain area of that concave piece that got cut. where typically it's a bias edge. So as I'm sewing through here, I'm taking a little bit more time to manipulate the fabric with my stiletto. I'm trying to take care and manipulate the fabric away from those edges because they are bias edges. And then as I transition out of the center of the curve back towards the short legs of the concave shape, I'm moving back towards bias cut edges, and that transition goes a lot smoother than normal for me. So there's definitely a big difference. Done. I like to press my curve seams toward the concave piece, and I generally take my time and try not to distort the block when I'm pressing the seam. Other than keeping in mind that the ochre edges of the concave shape were bias edges, I did not notice a big difference as I pressed. However, when I photographed the blocks, the edges of the ochre block do not look like they lay as flat. Because of the bias, they are a bit more wavy. Both blocks squared up nicely. So in summary, at this point, I am comfortable moving ahead using the fabric-saving concave pieces that I cut from fabric, but I will definitely be handling those pieces carefully until they are sewn into the pattern. What that means is that when possible, I will not let the bias edges be on the presser foot side of the seam, and I will reduce my presser foot pressure when sewing the block seams so that I don't distort those edges as I sew. For beginner sewers and sewers new to sewing curves, I would not recommend cutting concave shapes to have bias edges on the long, straight sides. But if you're in a pinch, rotating your template to make good use of fabric, or to get a cute fussy cut print to show just right, I think you can still obtain a wonderful result with just a bit more care as you handle those bias edges.